So, welcome to part two of the novels of Suburbia, the remote version. Uh, Before we get started today, continuing to talk about Jonathan Franzen, I just wanted to briefly mention to anyone who's interested, if there was anyone who is signed up or who's interested in signing up in either of my spring classes. The spring semester is going forward. Um, Apparently, Patrick is planning for the classes will start remotely, and then hopefully we'll switch back to regular classes at the appropriate time when that happens. But so I have my book discussion class in the morning on Wednesdays and my afternoon poetry class, which I'm pretty sure some of you are taking. So I just wanted to let you know that what's going to happen in the beginning is I'm going to be using Zoom. If you're not familiar with this, you probably will be hearing about it at some point because I had not heard of Zoom a few weeks ago, but now that we're all under quarantine, Zoom is everywhere. It's basically a conferencing technology or app, and it's pretty neat. It's very interesting and it's very easy to use, especially for the students. So as long as you have access to a computer or a phone or laptop or iPad, what have you, you can take part in class. And the nice thing about this will be that unlike this, where I'm making these YouTube videos with the Zoom, it will be just like being in class, except it will be through the computer. So I will be speaking live. If you're in class, the students, you will also be on the screen, and you can ask questions. We can interact and talk. So I just wanted to let you know that that's a possibility if you're interested. Okay, so let's see, what do we need to do today? Moving on. Okay, sorry, I'm just having some technical difficulties here oh, here we go, thank you. Sometimes the computer doesn't want to go along with what I wanted to go along with. Anyway, so today we are going to continue talking about life in suburbia. This is a picture I happened to see of a house in Webster Groves, which is again where Jonathan Franzen grew up. And I think it's very much representative of several of the books we've read, whether it's the Virgin Suicides or Roth's book or The Corrections, or actually all of the books, Revolutionary Road, White Noise. They all take place basically in middle or upper middle class, reasonably affluent suburbia. But before I go on to Franzen, I did want to mention I had a couple interesting comments from students in response to last week's video, and Don and Barbara from class had sent me an interesting email regarding Roth's American Pastoral. And what they had mentioned was that, and something that I was not aware of, was that the main character's name in Roth's book is Sweet Lvov, and apparently there's actually a town in Eastern Europe, which is what is or was part of Poland or Russian occupied Poland, well, which was called Lvov, L''VOV, or Lvov. And in the city, there's a very prestigious law school where two of the attorneys who took place in the Nuremberg war trials had gone to law school um, and were responsible for coming up with the term crimes against humanity, um, and as well as the definition of genocide. And Don had pointed this out, that he thought that Roth um, that this was probably intentional. And I was not aware of this, and I think it's a fascinating idea. And I have to agree. I think Roth probably was aware of this. Um, when we think back to Roth's book and the way that Swede is, well, his very name, his nickname, Swede, the way he's described as sort of having this sort of wearing this Viking or having a Viking mask, the blue eyes and the blonde hair. And it made me think that, what is Roth commenting on as far as potential or not potential, real anti-Semitism in American society. This was, part of the story takes place during or right after World War II, when Swede was young, and perhaps the fear that Jewish people had at the time, not only of anti-Semitism in Europe, but anti-Semitism in the United States. And therefore, does Swede have to wear a mask of sorts in order to try and blend in to what is perhaps considered, the true, in quotation marks, American, and what that means. I don't know, but I think it's a really interesting idea. I wish that we had an opportunity as a group to discuss this in class, because I think there's some really interesting ideas packed in that. And I also, Lynn left a comment on the YouTube page regarding the opening chapter of the corrections, which I will get to in just a few moments. But moving on, something else I wanted to mention is you may have seen, if you're watching, I believe it's on Hulu at the moment, there is a show called Little Fires Everywhere, which I believe it's sort of a mini series, and it's based on the book on the screen here by Celeste Ng, I believe her last name is pronounced, which actually we read a year or two ago, probably been 2 years ago, in my book discussion class. But I wanted to mention it because, again, you can tell just by the cover, this is very much in the tradition of the novel of The American Suburbs. This takes place in Shaker Heights, and which is very much this sort of trying to be the sort of perfect idea of the American dream, the American suburbs, sort of the height of American life. And yet, again, it contains all of the issues and contradictions that are going on below the surface. So I just wanted to mention that because it's in the news at the moment, so maybe something to keep an eye out for. So moving on to Franzen, I just wanted to provide a bit more context and biographical information about Franzen. Franzen, this is a picture of Franzen with the late David Foster Wallace. David Foster Wallace wrote several novels, but his most famous novel is Infinite Jest, which came out in, I believe, 1996, 95 or 96, and received a lot of attention. But I mention this because he and Franzen had an ongoing friendship, both as novelists and as people. They were both approximately the same age. They were seen as two of the biggest sort of up and coming novelists during the late 80s. And then Wallace was a bit ahead of him as far as his critical success with Infinite Jest. But nevertheless, they're basically peers. Wallace died, unfortunately, of suicide in 2008. But I wanted to mention this because Franzen has mentioned his friendship to Wallace on a number of occasions. There's an interesting New Yorker article which came out a few years ago, which you can read online if you're interested, about Wallace and his friendship with Wallace. This is a picture of Infinite Jest. As you can see, it's very much in the tradition of what I was talking about last week when I mentioned the Systems novel. Again, they are of the generation brought up reading the postmodern 1960s and 70s novels of people that I again mentioned last week, Thomas Pynchon and others. And one of the things that Wallace himself was famous for was footnotes. He would actually include footnotes in the novel itself. So you'll be reading the novel, and at the bottom of the page there'll be a number of footnotes. But it's that sort of a novel. It's highly intellectual, again, sprawling, covering sort of encyclopedic topics about American society. The core of his novel takes place in Boston and has to do with a character who is in a recovery, drug and alcohol recovery, sort of a halfway house, which is interesting because, again, it came out in '96, and to a certain extent, I think Wallace was ahead of the curve on sort of pinpointing something that was going to get a lot of attention later on, with just for example, with the opiate epidemic that we've seen over the past 10 or 15 years. This is a picture of Franzen with Don DeLillo. Again, another major influence on Franzen, both on Franzen and Wallace. This is an interview, I believe, at the New York Library, which you can listen to if you're interested on YouTube. I don't believe there's actually footage available, but it's basically Franzen interviewing DeLillo, which is interesting because DeLillo, he's done more recently, but historically he hadn't done a lot of interviews. He didn't do a lot of publicity. So this is sort of an interesting people of, I think a lot of writers of Franzen's generation, Franzen, Wallace, Jeffrey Eugenides, was also friends with both Franzen and Wallace. Sort of, I think, look to DeLillo as sort of a waypoint of what the American novel can be. So this is a picture of Oprah Winfrey, as you can see, with Franzen, and I just thought I would mention this because on the one hand, it's sort of appears to be sort of superficial. I don't know what you would call it exactly, just sort of media hyperbole. But on the other hand, it is actually, there are some interesting issues going on underneath the surface. What I'm talking about, if you're not familiar with it, the Corrections, when it came out in September of 2001, was picked by Oprah to be part of her book club. This was at the height of the Oprah Book Club. And as you can imagine, most writers probably, when they find out they've been picked for Oprah's book club, it's a little bit like maybe winning the lottery, in the sense that uh, she has an enormous sway in the media and this sort of PR and the attention that a book gets, especially I think back then at the height of her book club, would mean a lot as far as broadening your reading public and sales and what have you. But the reason this is interesting is because uh, Oprah picked the book for her book club. Franzen agreed to it. This obviously happened before the book was published, and I think right before the book was published or shortly afterwards, Franzen was quoted in print, sort of implying that he had regrets about agreeing to this. And I believe what he said in print was something to the effect that he was worried that it was going to perhaps scare male readers off. But there was also an implication of that perhaps Oprah's book club would be perceived as sort of bringing the novel down a bit. Perhaps it was a bit lowbrow. I believe he was quoted in an article referring to his book as being in the tradition of high art. So what happened was that Franzen he had been scheduled to appear on Oprah, and she uninvited him from the show. And she said this on the show. It had someone else on instead. And I believe they took the book club emblem off of any future books. And so this created a real discussion in the culture at the time about, you know, these different ideas about what is high art. You know, was Franzen being a snob? Did he have some relevant points about, you know, because the vast amount of readers in the country are female, and you know, did he have any valid points in worrying about male readers being scared away? So it really got into the sort of some culture wars about high and low culture, and at any rate, nevertheless, they did later make up, and I believe his later novel Freedom was picked for the Oprah book club, and he appeared on the show and did an interview. So all is well in the end. This is a cover of National Geographic, Why Birds Matter. The article is by Franzen. If you're not aware, Franzen is really into bird watching. And he has written, I think he wrote a book not too long ago, a nonfiction book, which wasn't about bird watching per se, but it was about the environment. He's very interested in environmental issues, and a lot of this ties into his bird watching. He's part of the article that he wrote about his friendship and dealing with the suicide of David Foster Wallace ties into a trip he took where he went bird watching on an island somewhere in, I believe, off South America in the South Pacific, where I believe it was where Robinson Crusoe in the book was stranded, or something to that amount, or maybe it was Robert Louis Stevenson. I'm not sure, but anyway, he's basically very interested in bird watching and environmental issues, and you see this both in his nonfiction and fiction, as we'll see later when we look at the cover of Freedom, which is this slide right here. So this is his book, Freedom, and you'll notice again there's a bird on the cover. So there are environmental issues going on here, but Freedom is also, I think you could, it would qualify as a book about the suburbs. It's about a marriage and relationship, and again, they tend to take place in the suburbs. This seems to be his sort of specialty. And this Freedom came out in 2010, and this is the last novel he wrote, Purity. And I believe this came out in 2015 or 16. He's had a couple nonfiction books come out since then, but I believe this was his last novel. As we, I think, saw in the corrections, and also in Freedom and Purity, he's investigating these ideas about, what is it that we are sort of striving for in America. Again, the title Freedom, what does freedom mean? Americans talk a lot about freedom. It's sort of one of our favorite words to use as Americans. But freedom to do what? What does freedom mean in the context of sort of late market capitalism in the 21st century? Freedom to do what? Freedom from what? And purity, again, and there's sort of connections here with, I think, with the corrections. If you think about the title, the corrections, well, on one hand, the corrections, it's actually a stockbroker term, and you see that in the corrections. He's interested in the economy of the 90s going into the 2000s, which has so rapidly changed by technology. So a correction is a stockbroker term. We know when there are issues in the market, they talk about market corrections. But also, the more broadly, with relation to the novel, is what are the corrections that are going on in the novel? People seem to be trying to correct other people, right? This is I think a common theme that you see with, especially with families, parents and children. The desire to want to sort of fix someone, make them perfect. In marriages, people want to try and correct themselves. But again, just as with freedom, what would that mean? What would that look like? What does it mean, to correct someone? And again, with purity, there is historically an obsession in American culture and more specifically in American literature with an idea of purity. And perhaps this relates back to the Puritans, and this sort of, the early American Protestant, work ethic, and this desire to be sort of free of sin, this striving for some sort of purity, but within the context of the material world, obviously that's something that's not attainable, and therefore, what happens when you have a society that is obsessed with this sort of purity? So this is a video, and I want to play a little bit of it. This is an interview with Franzen from within the past few years, and it's sort of interesting. So let me just get this set up and you can watch some of this.
I would probably say I was always a writer. I'm one of those lucky people who figured out early what they were good at. So already by the time I was done with high school, I thought being a writer and having a lot of free time, making things up, escaping from the world, that all sounded good to me. And how I became that, just didn't know any better and got out of college. Didn't like college very much. Got out of college, and one of the wonderful things about a novel is you don't have to have any professional training. It's a form of it. Anybody can sit down and start writing a novel. So that's what I did.
But this early love for literature, could you try to put some words on it? Because before we write, we probably read.
Oh yeah, no. I mean, what really made me a writer? I was actually just talking about it with Kathy last night. We were at a reading here in town. A local fiction writer, very good, named Lisa McKenzie, and she was talking about writing being an escape from the world. Sort of, you almost dissociate when you are writing and when you're reading. And she said, not that and her son and husband were there. She said, not that I'm trying to get away from anything now, but there were earlier times in my life when it really was good to dissociate. And we came home from that reading, and I was talking about how that had been me in 7th, 8th, and 9th grade. I think a lot of people have trouble with junior high school, and I had a lot of trouble with junior high school. And books were, it's not that I didn't have any friends. I had a few good friends, but I had a lot of time, and life at school was so miserable for so many reasons that just to come home and then to spend all summer sitting in one chair reading, for 3, 6, in some cases 8 or 10 hours, that was how I survived. And you pick up that habit as a young person, and it stays with you. You become, in a sense, you have two communities. You have a community of real people, and then you have a community that you form as a reader with these writers who are not present, who you will never meet, many of whom are dead, but they are nonetheless, they feel like a kind of social life, really. And I did not have much of a social life back then.
Those early readings, were there patterns there? Because you ended up studying German
Yeah, that
literature.
was later.
That was later.
Yeah.
But were there special writers that you were interested in?
I didn't read that many novels starting out. Fiction was kind of disapproved of in my household. My mother in particular thought there was something immoral about fiction. It was lies. Why would you read a book full of lies? This never happened. This was made up. So I read a lot of nonfiction, a lot of science, actually, which has stood me in good stead. If you spend your childhood reading science, then as science proceeds, you kind of keep up with it. But I was very, very taken with Tolkien. There was a whole set of childhood books as well, and in a way, Tolkien is the natural extension of that. They're books for grown-ups, but they're kind of children's books in a way. And then I got into sci-fi.
Sorry, I'm just going to jump ahead for a moment on the video. There we go.
Technique. And, another another signature, I think there's kind of a comic tone to all of the novels. And there again, it's not like that corresponds to some, well, I've made it into kind of a theoretical point. I will argue that humor is a vital ingredient in fiction and that no novelist should be without it, but the fact is, it's just something I could do. And so to the extent that there's a humor in the voice, or humor at the center, irony on one side, satire on another, but that kind of spectrum, that just, again, that's my native voice. It's how I am in just ordinary life. I like to laugh. I like to make people laugh, and it was a useful strategy of coping in an intense family. So a lot of these things that seem like possible, themes or signatures are really just, what you have at hand when you turn 21 and set out to be a writer. It's like, I had this family and I had this way of laughing at it, and you go from there.
I didn't at all mean to label your books. What I find is that you're questioning the surface. You have something on the surface,
Yeah.
and you look behind it, and you take it apart.
I find complexity, ambiguity, contradiction interesting. And there again, I can make a kind of theoretical argument about literature's role in providing a sense of the tragic ambiguity of life, anything like that. But in fact, it's that it's just more interesting. Pages are more interesting if you're blowing something open. And it has to do, I think, with, ultimately I'm trying to entertain. I'm trying to give the reader a good time. And for me as a reader, part of a good time is a sense of, wow, this is so interesting. It's like, it's not simple. And because I'm so committed to books, they have an almost religious role in my life. Part of what serious readers look for in a book is an impression of depth, possibly infinite depth. If you look at someone like Alice Munro, seemingly simple stuff, and as she herself has said, you realize that in any situation, there is no limit to how many layers you can go down. You think you've gotten to the bottom, and it turns out you can go even deeper, and things get even more complicated and interesting when you do. Her particular genius is to manage to get that sensation of depth into these short stories. But yeah.
You're such a vivid storyteller, even though your books are 600, 700, 800 pages long.
550 in English.
Oh, well, I have the German translation.
Oh,
That's
boy.
No, but you're from page one, you're into the story, and I have the feeling there's a man who really loves to tell a story.
Sure.
Could you tell me something about your writing process? When you're not giving interviews, when you're sitting at your desk writing?
Or more like it, mostly I sit at my desk and don't write and think about why I'm unable to write. Well, Godard said, all you need is a girl and a gun to make a movie. Fiction writer, yeah, you can write a novel with a girl and a gun, but what I would say you need a problem and you need a tone. And if you're hearing it, if the sentences pop with a particular tone, and you have taken care to set up a problem right on page 1, there you go. You're in. It's makes it sound simple, but you can spend 4 or 5 years wandering in the desert looking for the tone and the problem. Because it's got to be the right tone, it's got to be the right problem. But it really, at this point, it feels that simple to me.
Are you becoming your characters while writing them?
No, not really. In the same way that there's a kind of magic as you sit quietly, whatever, in an airport lounge, reading a book, and somehow you are experiencing, rather vividly, something that is simply not present. There's a perfect inverse in the way in which the mechanical process of putting words on the page, starting to write a sentence, after a sentence or two, you are in that dream, but it's not. It's an interesting thing because there are many parts of the brain working simultaneously. I am at this point, it's become almost second nature, but not quite second nature. I am worrying about punctuation, even though I'm completely in the dream. I'm so aware that I'm also putting words on the page. So I'm worried about varying sentence structure, and I'm monitoring adverb use. I'm doing all of these things. If I were really being the character, I would just, supposedly be oblivious of. So I don't think it makes any sense to talk about becoming a character. You're still the writer, but you're the writer having this dream.
In Europe, especially.
So that was a bit of Jonathan Franzen. So what I would like to do now, just briefly, is let me just.
Where I come from.
Sorry.
I didn't realize it.
I wanted to mention, Lynn had left a comment in underneath the YouTube video from last week. I believe in last week's video, I read the first paragraph of the novel, and suggested that perhaps you could read it as well and see what you thought. I think it's a remarkable first novel, and so I just wanted to respond because Lynn's response to the paragraph was that that it seemed to perfectly describe a sort of empty nest syndrome or feeling, and I think that's really spot on. I think Franzen accomplishes so much in the first paragraph of the story, not least of which is the second word is madness. The madness of an autumn prairie cold front coming through. Well, first of all, that establishes the weather and the location, that we're in the Midwest. But also madness is a theme that runs throughout the novel. All of the characters, I think, in one way or another, are sort of going crazy, sort of unraveling. Some more than others, but they're all sort of unraveling in their own lives. Also, the words that Franzen uses, the sun low in the sky, there's this feeling of afterness that's going on, which, ties into Alfred and Enid's life, the type of people they are at this point, the way the house is described, there's a feeling of emptiness. The sun low in the sky, a minor light, a cooling star, the shadows lengthened, the yellowing leaves, this autumn feeling, storm windows shuttered in empty bedrooms, and yet you have this tension between this sort of intensity, the madness of an autumn prairie cold front, with also this, there's a sort of pedestrian quality to where it's taking place. Suddenly you hear the drone and hiccup of a clothes dryer, the nasal contention of a leaf blower, the ripening of local apples in a paper bag. That there's this tension going on. So on the one hand, these are just normal everyday lives, regular people in a suburb somewhere in America, and yet there's all this drama. He's sort of foreshadowing the storm that's coming to all of their lives, whether it's the issues with Alfred's illness and his health, his physical decline and mental decline, and all the other characters, and the issues that Chip has. So I just wanted to mention that because I agree the empty nest idea. There is a feeling of emptiness that he gets from the very beginning. But the thing that's interesting also, though, is I think even though this novel deals with, in many ways, very dark issues. Franzen, his parents are his parents or grandparents who were originally from Northern Europe, and I think in Franzen there is a Northern European sensibility of there's a certain darkness, but there's also comedy. I think it's a very funny book. There's comedy that runs throughout that I think plays nicely with the darker, more serious issues, and makes it really more palatable if it were only, say, the dark issues. So I think I talked about some of the themes last week. The themes of families, the East Coast and the Midwest, parents and children. There are all these dichotomies in the novel. But my question to you would be, and this is why it would be nice if we were in class and could discuss this, is to hear your thoughts on what you think the themes are, and especially your thoughts on the ending of the novel. I think there's a certain ambiguity to the ending and how it's interpreted. I think it could be read as a positive, sort of uplifting ending. There's a potential there, that Enid is, she's going to make some changes. But others have read that with a more cynical point of view, in that there perhaps won't really be any real changes, that maybe this is happy talk. I tend to go with a more positive interpretation, but I think you could make a good case for either. So if you would like to share any of your thoughts on the ending of the novel or anything in the novel, what you thought about it, please feel free to email me, or if you want to, you can leave comments in the YouTube comment section, or on any of the novels that we read this semester, or how they relate to Franzen's novel. So thank you very much, and I hope you all stay well and healthy, and I hope to see you soon. Okay, thank you.